American Airlines CEO blames Army for collision as Transport Secretary calls it preventable. Live updates. Transport Secretary Sean Duffy claims a horror mid-air plane crash over Washington, D.C. was preventable, while American Airlines appeared to blame the pilot of a military helicopter that strayed into its path. 60 passengers, 4 crew, and 3 U.S. Army personnel are believed to be dead after the collision 400 foot over the Potomac River. The American Airlines plane smashed into a U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter as it came into land at Reagan National Airport just before 9 p.m. on Wednesday. Passengers aboard Flight 5342 from Wichita, Kansas, included members of the U.S. figure skating team who were returning from the U.S. Figure Skating Championships. The aircraft collided in a huge fireball that was visible on dashcams of cars driving on highways that snake past the airport and crashed into the Potomac River. The helicopter was flying a training sortie and cut through the airspace from the opposite direction under cover of darkness, with both aircraft seemingly unaware of the other's presence. More than 300 first responders and rescue workers were deployed to the Potomac on inflatable boats while others erected searchlights to illuminate the murky waters in a desperate hunt for survivors. At least 28 bodies have been pulled from the water as rescuers worked through the night in the vain hope of finding survivors. Officials now believe no one survived, and the focus of the search is recovering the bodies and notifying families. American Airlines Chief Executive Robert Isom appeared to blame the U.S. Army Black Hawk pilot for being in the wrong place. At this time, we don't know why the military aircraft came into the path of the PSA aircraft, he said. Transport Secretary Sean Duffy agreed with President Donald Trump that the crash was preventable. It was, I would say, standard communication, so there was not a breakdown, if that's your question, in communication between the military helicopter and the American airline flight. There was communication between the aircraft and the tower, he said. I would say that the helicopter was aware that the plane was in the area. We are going to wait for all the information to come in from this vantage point, but what I've seen so far, do I think this was preventable? Absolutely. Duffy said both the military helicopter and the airliner were flying a standard fight pattern like hundreds of flights before. This was a clear night last night. The helicopter was in the standard pattern. If you live in the D.C. area, you will see helicopters up and down the river, he said. The American airline flight coming into land was in a standard flight pattern as it was coming into DCA. So this was not unusual with a military aircraft flying the river and aircraft landing at DCA. During his speech this morning, Donald Trump confirmed that he is immediately appointing an acting commissioner to the FAA, Christopher Rocheleau. Rocheleau is a 22-year veteran of the agency. Donald Trump has addressed the nation following the tragedy in D.C. last night. The president started his speech with a moment of silence. He bowed his head and held his silence for nearly half a minute in respect of those who lost their lives in the aircraft crash. A young woman who sent her husband a haunting final text shortly before dying in the Washington, D.C. plane crash has been identified. Azra Hussein messaged husband Hamid Raza, 25, to say, "We're landing in 20 minutes" as American Eagle Flight 5342 approached Reagan National Airport just before 8 p.m. Eastern Time Wednesday night. Tragically, it was the last text Azra, 26, would ever send. Her shaken husband of 2 years, Hamza Raza, 25, was filmed explaining how he'd texted a few replies but that they'd never been received. Azra Hussein was among 67 people killed after a U.S. Army helicopter slammed into the American Eagle Flight as it approached Reagan Airport in D.C. First Lady Melania Trump sent her condolences to the victims of the plane crash in Washington, D.C. She wrote, "My heart goes out to those impacted by last night's terrible tragedy. I pray for those who so sadly lost their lives, their families and loved ones, and the first responders who have worked tirelessly through the night. May they find strength and solace in this difficult time." Her husband, President Trump, is expected to address the nation in a matter of minutes. Before Wednesday's decider, American Airlines had not suffered a fatal crash in almost 16 years despite 100 million planes taking off with 10 billion passengers. Flying is so safe, you are 100 times more likely to die in a car, 3 times more likely on the subway, and about the same chance as being struck by lightning. The last deadly crash was on February 12, 2009. When Colgan Air Flight 3407 crashed near Buffalo due to pilot error, killing all 54 people on board. American Airlines Flight 5342 going down after colliding with a military helicopter, killing 64 on the plane and 3 in the chopper, is the worst U.S. air disaster since American Airlines Flight 587 killed 265 people on November 12, 2001. That disaster was just 2 months after 9/11. Air travel wasn't so safe. A series of deadly crashes in the mid-1990s had the fatal crash rate of 1 for every 2 million departures. But a massive overhaul of airline processes and safety standards slashed accidents and near misses. Until Wednesday. Flights have officially resumed at DCA this morning. 2 Southwest jets took off in rapid succession after the horror crash last night. Nikki Schwab, Daily Mail's chief political campaign correspondent, is at the airport and shared an image of the first plane taking off just after 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Air traffic control radar footage showed the fateful moment the 2 aircraft crossed paths. The American Airlines flight, labeled JIA 5342, and the Army Black Hawk helicopter, labeled PAT-25, appeared to be facing each other head-on leading up to the crash. The helicopter's path remained relatively straight while the American Airlines flight veered to make its landing, and the 2 collided. Former President Joe Biden has expressed his sorrow at the tragic plane crash. Biden, who relinquished power to Donald Trump earlier this month, said that he and his wife Jill are praying for the families of the victims. American figure skater Jon Maravilla was scheduled to fly to D.C. on American Airlines Flight 5342 after a developmental camp in Wichita, Kansas, but was denied boarding. Maravilla took his dog to the event with him, but when he got to the airport he was told the pet was too big and couldn't come on board. The skater was furious at the time, but it turned out to be a stroke of luck as both their lives were saved. Not allowed past gate to board flight? Get me the F***K out of Kansas, please, he wrote on an Instagram story from the airport. He instead got in a car and drove home, writing 14-hour journey begins in another story. Maravilla told a Russian Telegram channel that there were 14 figure skaters on board the plane, plus coaches, staff, and families. Fox News anchor Sean Hannity read a congressman's off-the-record text live on air, revealing details about the vast scope of the tragic American Airlines plane and U.S. Army helicopter crash Wednesday night. While the search for passengers continues, an unidentified congressman has reportedly told Hannity in a series of off-the-record texts that nearly all travelers are dead. I'll keep it off the record, but a well-known congressman just wrote me and said off the record. This congressman is telling me and confirming what Kevin Corke said, that this congressman is being told that there are 60-plus dead. Hannity did not clarify whether the number included all travelers aboard the jet and helicopter or just flyers on the plane. This is a moment that Sean Hannity read a congressman's off-the-record text revealing details about the tragic American Airlines plane and U.S. Army helicopter crash. Wichita, Kansas. Airport Director Jesse Romo said American Airlines Flight 5342 departed as normal. The doomed plane flew out of the city at 5:22 p.m. Central Standard Time on Wednesday and crashed as it tried to land in Washington, D.C. To our knowledge, everything occurred as normal. So, there was no abnormality to the operation, he said. International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach expressed condolences after numerous elite figure skaters, young developing athletes, their families, and coaches were killed on board. We are deeply saddened by the tragic air accident in Washington, D.C., he said. On behalf of the IOC and personally, I extend our heartfelt sympathies to all those affected, which we understand may include Olympians, young athletes, and their support staff. Our thoughts are with all the victims, their families, and loved ones during this incredibly difficult time. Victims included members of the U.S. figure skating team who were returning from the U.S. Figure Skating Championships. Russian former world champions Yevgenia Shishkova and Vadim Naumov were also on board. Wichita Mayor Lily Wu cried as she spoke of the plane crash on Thursday morning. American Airlines Flight 5342 flew out of the city in Kansas on Wednesday night and crashed as it tried to land in Washington, D.C. We mourn with all those who have been impacted. This is a terrible tragedy that will unite those in Washington, D.C. and Wichita, Kansas forever, she said. At this time, our community needs to come together to support the family members who have been impacted. To come together in honor of those individuals on that flight, and as a council, we will lead in bringing this community together to pray for our community, but also move our community to know that there are resources, and as a city, we will have additional resources, especially for staff who have been impacted,